Joining us from Miami is Dr. Eileen Marti, professor of infectious diseases at Florida International University. Eileen, always good to see you. Asking women to avoid pregnancy. What's happening in Brazil is that they're doing that without giving them the needed information or access to contraceptives, and then they also ban abortion even if a fetus is found to have microcephaly. It seems you put that all together and you've got a perfect storm.
Yeah, it's a difficult situation because it's an infectious disease problem, it's a medical problem, it's a developmental problem, it's a psychological problem, it's an incredibly stressful set of circumstances, it's a social problem, and there's moral dilemmas involved.
Now, one of the top Brazilian bishops has argued that people are using Zika to try and legalize abortion, but there's little likelihood that that's going to happen in Brazil, that they'll relax the abortion laws.
Well, I think that perhaps the bishop ought to have a conversation with the Pope, because Pope Francis has weighed in on this.
He has weighed in on that. He has specifically said that he believes that contraceptives would be morally acceptable to combat Zika. So do you think that's what needs to happen, an aggressive move toward contraceptive education and availability of contraceptions, especially to the contraceptives, to the people who are suffering from this, which are mostly poor people?
Yeah, this is a very difficult situation. And, you know, various different religions do have clauses for emergency circumstances that will cease applying when an emergency is over. Jewish laws are that way, that you can break certain laws to save a life. The popes in the past, I forget whether it was John the 23rd or Paul the 6th, during a crisis in Belgium, advised Belgian nuns to use contraceptives because there was a problem with rapes going on of the nuns at that time. I mean, these things are temporary measures that are taken in extreme circumstances, and if the church can bend the laws, then certainly legal institutions need to understand that under certain kinds of circumstances, you have to have informed ways in which you can properly do things. And you have to know exactly what you're talking about, because without the right information, then illegal abortions can happen, unnecessary deaths of perfectly healthy babies can happen. Mm-hmm. We don't want anything like that to occur. We need information, clear and consistent. And in terms of the Zika problem specifically, and specifically with this question of contraception and so forth, and I know how hard it can be for a young girl to maybe have any control of when she does or doesn't get pregnant, especially in an impoverished situation. But one thing people ought to understand is that for example, nations where Zika has existed for much longer periods of time, such as in Africa, we're not seeing these kinds of problems. We're not sure why we're not, but perhaps it is because
are you convinced then that about the connection between Zika and microcephaly?
I think that the evidence is very, very strong. What I want to make clear is that the timing of an infection makes a huge difference into consequences. For example, rubella. We know rubella can cause microcephaly and these problems, but if you have the rubella vaccine, or if you had rubella when you were very, very young, way young before you ever get pregnant, then your risks are none for having a microcephalic child. So the timing of a Zika infection is important. So therefore, if you use the contraception, then you get Zika, and then 2 years later you get pregnant, the odds are you're completely immune and cannot, and no problem will happen to the child. So timing is also an important thing that has to be taken into consideration.
Yeah, that's a story I'm sure we'll keep covering. Eileen Marti, always good to talk to you. Thank you.
My pleasure.
The Pentagon is taking a new tactic in the fight against ISIL. The